Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to.
So our topic today is about data and analytics for product management. Now, I know there's been a lot of sessions on that, and we wanted to do something a little bit different today and talk about how a team is actually working with that on a daily basis. And joining us to explore the topic is Alison Ma, who is the Director of Product at Crowdlinker, where she works with her team and clients to strategize and execute on their vision and improve their products. So welcome, Alison, to at Product AMA. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Great. Good to see you. And I mean, see you literally. So I like to start with a little background on your journey in product or to product management. So you started as an engineer and an Android developer before getting into product management specifically. Can you share with us what led you to product management and your current role at Crowdlinker?
Yeah, sure. So throughout university and my early career in engineering, I knew it wasn't my passion, but I didn't know what was yet. And at this point, I hadn't discovered product management. It wasn't as common, I guess, 5 years ago. And so one thing I was passionate about was using tech to help people. And so I was working at a health tech startup, and we started with a wearable device, and then we pivoted to doing a mobile app. And so that's why I got into Android development. And throughout this time, I knew that I didn't enjoy coding. I wanted to think more about the users and the product in a more holistic way, what features are solving what problems for these users. But there was no PM at the startup. And so there was no, I knew that I wanted to work on more high level things, but I didn't know that there was a role like that out there. And then a friend introduced me to that idea of product management, and it was like a major revelation for me. I was like, oh, there's something out there that does this. This is amazing. And so I started taking online courses and applying for jobs. And so that's how I kind of got into product management and why I was interested in it. And then I joined Crowdlinker about 2 years ago now. And at that point, we were a team of two. And one of the clients I was working with when I first joined is still one of our clients now, so it's pretty cool to see how that product has changed over the past 2 years. And then an opportunity came up for me to take on the director of product role, while the previous director of product moved into a more operations role. And so now I oversee a team of 2 PMs, and I still manage some products.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So let's talk about how you're using data and analytics at Crowdlinker. And I'm guessing that you rely on data to help your clients in their products, but you probably also use data to inform your own business and plans. Are there other ways you think about data and analytics, and how does that work?
Yeah, so with clients, sometimes it's setting up analytics for the first time. A lot of the clients that we work with are early stage founders that are building up the first version of their product. And then some clients have a more established product, so it's trying to become more data driven and using data to determine whether the things that we're releasing are successful and kind of prioritize based on what we see from the data. So for example, one thing I'm working on right now is redesigning some pages for a better user experience. And so we're digging into Google Analytics and Hotjar to see how are users using this information or using this page. But we also want to send out some surveys and talk to some users to get a better sense of how we can make this experience better for them to find the content more easily. So that's kind of like the client side. And then to inform our own business, there's also certain KPIs that we track on the product team. So of course, things like budgets and profits and how much time was estimated for a project versus how much time we actually logged. And then also, because we're a consultancy, knowing how satisfied or happy our clients were with certain engagements is really important to us. So kind of tracking like an NPS for clients because a lot of our clients come through referrals or they re-engage on a new project. So that's another big metric for us, as well as measuring how happy or satisfied the team was working on that.
Cool. So tell us a little bit more about how you get started with clients. Like is data and analytics something you introduce immediately at the beginning, or there's some other steps and parameters that you establish, and then how do you introduce it?
Yeah, so I think it's never usually like the highest priority. I think just building something is one of the first priorities, and validating what you're building without necessarily using analytics to validate that. But once once it does become more important is after maybe you're getting ready to launch and you want to be able to track how that product is doing. And so with setting up analytics for the first time, we have to figure out what's important to track, what events, user properties, screens, that kind of thing, what's important, coming up with like a naming convention so that it's easy to understand what these things are and keeping it consistent so that 6 months from now you don't look back at what this is and question whether it's what it actually is, and just making sure that you're tracking the most important things versus necessarily trying to track every single interaction in the app or the product, or putting too much focus into tracking everything and putting it into a dashboard, and it just becomes overwhelming because of the amount of data you're trying to capture right away. And so that's kind of like how setting it up works. And then in this stage of a product, I think one thing I've come to realize is that it's okay that a lot of decisions are just based on gut instinct when you're building out that first version. You might be getting some user feedback as you build it out, or getting some more qualitative data like user interviews or user testing. But for the most part, a lot of it is still just gut instinct and what you think is the right thing to build. And so at first I thought this was like, no, we need to have data. We need to make sure that these are informed decisions, instead of just driving the product roadmap based on random feedback you get or just what's in your mind. And so I think it's important for founders to just make sure they don't get in the cycle of building features and making sure that you're also measuring the success of those features or these new releases. Instead of thinking like, once we get this new feature out there, the product's gonna be successful, we're gonna get a bunch more users because this is exactly what they needed. And you kind of keep repeating that, like, once we get this feature, then we're gonna be successful and that kind of thing. So it becomes more and more important to have those metrics in place to help you prioritize and build the things that matter.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something that I can't remember exactly who introduced it. Maybe Brian Balfour or somebody like that. But it's called the feature death cycle or something like that, where it's like this circle where step one is, oh, we need a new feature to get more interest in our products, and so we introduce that with a big launch. There's a spike in usage, but then it flattens out, and then you do the same thing over again, right? So
right. Yeah. Exactly.
It never really gets anywhere. Yeah. So I guess tie it back to sort of the business objectives, right? That's really driving a lot of what you decide to measure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Just for everybody that's online, you can ask your questions in the chat. So please get those questions flowing, and I'll discuss them with Alison. So there's an interesting question about how you use data differently on a new product that you're launching versus an existing product that you're kind of iterating on. Now, so maybe can you talk to us a little bit and give us an example of, how you would work with data on a new product when, maybe you have some users, or maybe you don't even have any users. Is there data that you gather to help inform you at that early stage?
Right. Yeah. So I think having analytics in place is important, but at the same time, qualitative data is probably going to be a lot more useful in the beginning when you don't have that many users to be able to say that this is a significant amount of data showing us that we need to do this. So I think it's a matter of balancing both qualitative and quantitative data, especially in the beginning. And then also for existing products, I think it's a matter of becoming more and more data-driven. So sometimes you have analytics in place, but it's not quite actionable yet. So it's a lot of information might be just good to know versus having specific hypotheses or questions that you're trying to answer with that data. Or maybe you're using that data in more of like a superficial level, so that you have like a KPI dashboard where you're tracking the most important things, but you don't know necessarily what to do with that information, or you're not using it to track specific features or releases. So I think what becomes really important is before you release anything, or before you're even thinking about building up that new feature, well, first have a goal in mind, but then have specific metrics in place to measure whether that's successful or not, and really understanding how you'll measure success, so that you don't end up just releasing this feature and then you're like, oh, well, I should have actually tracked what it did before so I know whether this is successful or not. And it's too late then because it's already out there. So I think it's just becoming more and more focused on the goals and making sure that you're tracking the right things as you build out new features.
Right. Yeah, let's come back around to that because there's some interesting ideas there. But give us an example of how you would talk about data to a client for whom you're starting to work on a sort of new idea or new product. is there, something other than usage that would be more related to behavior or something like that that you would start to use? Like, how would you talk to a client about that?
Talk to a client about like what to track? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because if you don't have some data, then, or qualitative or quantitative, then it's sort of like my opinion or your opinion, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you address that with a client when they think, oh, this is the way we should go, right?
Yeah, that's definitely hard. I think if you really, hopefully there's still some sources of data. So maybe it's just having internal people that are testing this app and giving some feedback. Maybe it's reviews in the App Store, or maybe it's just comparing to what other competitors are doing, to just so you have something to reference versus just my opinion versus your opinion. And if it really does get down to that, where it's just my opinion versus your opinion, I think that's when it's important to say, okay, let's start introducing some ways to measure these things so that it's not just us two deciding whether this is the right option or not, and just starting to become more and more data driven.
Right. Yeah, we always used to laugh that, if it was just opinion, your opinion or the CEO's opinion, you always lose, right? So right. The only way you're going to combat that is with some data.
Yeah.
And the famous one is your opinion, while interesting, is not what the data says.
Yeah.
So that's cool. Well, one of the frequent questions that we get, or I see from product managers, is how do you figure out what metrics to track? Are there a set of steps or kind of a process that you go through to determine what those important things are to track and measure?
So one really good framework I like is the idea of a North Star metric. And Amplitude has a ton of great content on this. If you just Google North Star metric Amplitude, you'll find some great resources. But the idea behind a North Star metric is that this is the one metric that captures the core value that your product delivers to your users. And so the idea is that you're focusing on what really matters. It's the value that you're giving your users. And that in return should also help you have a pulse on how well your business is doing because of how well it's delivering that value or not. So an example of this is, let's say it's Netflix. It's how often or maybe how long users are watching content for on a weekly or monthly basis. And the reason that it's the core value is because that's how, it's all about consuming content. And so Netflix wants their users to consume that content, stay subscribed, and continue watching content. And so it's from this one North Star metric that you could focus your efforts towards improving. And then you can break down this North Star metric into some further metrics, which are maybe a little bit more actionable or movable versus that top level metric. So you could break it down into things like, well, how many users do we even have on Netflix? How many new users are we getting? So maybe we need to focus a little bit on acquisition or getting more users to convert to paying for the trial. And then the other aspect could be how often they're watching content. Maybe we need to improve retention or engagement and get them to come back into the app more often. Another part of that could have been how long they spend watching content in that one session, and how can we get them to watch more content through things like personalization or recommendations, just to get them to continue watching. And so you can kind of break down your metric into some more detailed things and focus there. But the idea is that it all ladders back up to this North Star.
Right. And do you get into building journey maps or things like that to sort of understand the user stories and what the users are doing in order to kind of raise those specific points that you want to measure?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. So it's there's all these different steps in the journey where we want them to reach this end goal. And that end goal is probably that last metric you're trying to measure, is how often they're coming back to watch content. And so there's different steps. It's the first time they use the app, can we make that first experience amazing? Can we make them addicted to this app basically and continue to come back? And so you can break it down into all these different steps and kind of measure some sort of metric for each of these steps in the funnel. And so that you can see where the drop-off is and try to improve it from that step.
Great. Yeah, that's useful. A lot of product people, or just even marketing people, are using some very simple sort of NPS type sentiment metrics, right? What's your view on how useful that is? Does it have a place in it, or really should you be focusing on behavior more than anything?
I feel like it's a very contended topic, NPS. So I think it's a good way to get like an initial sense of how your customers feel about your product. One problem might be, so let's say you find out that NPS score is a 6. You don't necessarily know what to do with that information in the sense that you don't know why it's given a 6. So it's still important to ask those kind of follow-up questions and figure out why it's rated this versus something else and how you can improve the product to improve that NPS score. So that's part of it. And then another aspect, which I think NPS doesn't really capture, is like, it's would you share this with, how satisfied are you, and would you share this with someone else? And I think it's easy to say, yeah, I would definitely share this with someone else, but are they actually referring someone else to this product? So it's like measuring what actually happens could be different than that NPS score.
Right. Yeah, I kind of look at it as a warning flag, if you will. So it's not so much that the 6 is good or bad, but it's, if you measure that over time, does it go from a 6 to a 7 or from a 6 to a 5, right? And that's kind of the flag that, oh, okay, we got to dig into this a little more and figure out what's going on here.
Right. Yeah. Like it's time to pay attention if you do see a bigger change in it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I do a lot of work with product market fit with early stage startups. And so of course we're looking at not only increasing engagement and adoption and usage, but also looking at churn, not just with the subscription or product revenue, but also in usage. And one of the things that is really interesting is to look at cohorts in, especially a SaaS type environment, but you can look at cohorts and track those over time with those kinds of metrics. Do you guys do any of that sort of stuff?
I haven't had a chance to make use of cohorts recently, but I do think it's a great way to really segment things and measure whether there was an impact versus just looking at like, I released this feature on this date and I want to track from before this date to after this date, but actually seeing the differences in behavior based on cohorts that have used this feature versus haven't. I think that's a pretty powerful way to see whether the things are actually successful or not.
That's great. Okay, cool. Just as a reminder to everybody, you can ask your questions on the Zoom group chat in your application there. We'll bring those up in a few minutes as we get further into this, but would love to hear from you. This is Product Ask Me Anything, so we'd love to get your questions. There is a question here from Rhythm who says, when you don't have a lot of actionable data, how do you balance your gut and qualitative feedback from user testing for further iterations? Yeah,
so I think I mean, this is kind of like the cop-out answer first, but I think at some point there's never going to be a full set of data for you to say this is exactly the right approach. I think there's always going to be a little bit of a gamble in anything that you do, and so you can rely on data as much as you have it, but at the same time, it's sometimes just about making that bet and seeing what happens afterwards. And so I think it's just a matter of having a hypothesis in mind and treating it like an experiment so that even though you have that data or maybe you don't, there's something you can learn from it and you can iterate from there versus just kind of thinking that you need that data to be able to take action.
Right, and that's sort of goes back to one of the fundamental principles, I guess, is that before you're starting to use data, you really have to start with a question, right, or a hypothesis. Okay, I believe that this is the case. How are we going to test that? What can we design to test that? What kind of data can we get to validate it, right? Very, very much like a scientific method, That's great. Yeah, I think oftentimes we're faced with overwhelming amounts of data. We can collect massive amounts of data, and so the question comes up: okay, well, which should I pay attention to? How do I, sort of sort the noise out from this? And I think it goes back to having a good question, right?
Yeah, and I think like on the flip side is when you have too much data, you can kind of get into this trap of always needing data to back things up before you can take an action, where everything needs to be validated first before you take any sorts of actions, and you kind of end up in this state of just collecting data and analyzing data versus also experimenting and seeing if it actually works.
We call that analysis paralysis, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a term for that. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Well, let's go back to your earlier comment about qualitative and quantitative. I've heard it said that quantitative is really important, but it gives you evidence that something of what is happening. Whereas qualitative really gives you the underlying motivation or reason, the explanation why it's happening. Do you see that as important all through the sort of data and analytics process, or are there certain points at which one is more useful than the other?
I can see the qualitative data being more useful in the beginning. But at the same time, I do think that it's always important to have both, just because quantitative data alone isn't going to give you that overall like sentiment of how your users are using your product. And you might lose touch with like the actual user behavior if you're just looking at quantitative data versus also talking to users and seeing them use the product and just getting that kind of in-person feedback.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that whole thing about get out of the office and talk to customers, right? I don't know if you remember, but in the early days of pragmatic marketing, when they were talking about the framework, they had this acronym called NIHITO. Nothing important happens in the office. so spend your time talking to customers, right? That's great. Well, just as a reminder to everybody, this is an Ask Me Anything event, so conversation. So we'd love to have your questions and things that you're finding challenging with data and analytics. But in the meantime, Alison, can you talk about some of the key challenges that you guys face with data and analytics, maybe with your clients or in your own business? And then what kind of advice do you have from that experience?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've been challenged with throughout my career is not seeing significant change after you do release something. And just, I think it's important to realize that it's really hard to move those top level metrics and for it to be like a significant change. So let's say like your retention went up 2% after you launched this new feature. It's hard to say whether that was really because of this feature, or maybe it's just slightly higher because there's always variation. Maybe there's something else that happened that caused it to increase. And so it can be kind of demotivating to continue to iterate on this when it's such small changes. And so one advice I have for that is to A/B test things, just so that you can really be sure whether something is because of that feature or if there's some other reason for it, and basically having that baseline to measure against. And then the second advice is that back to the idea of like how everything is kind of like a gamble or a bet. The bigger the bet, the higher the potential for reward. So if there's going to be a bigger change, you're more likely to see a bigger result or a more significant result. So sometimes it's about optimizing and iterating on something smaller, but at other times it's about taking those bigger risks in order to see that bigger change.
Interesting. And how, I mean, it's important to mitigate risk when, identify those risks and mitigate them. Sometimes data is a big part of that. But is there sort of a trade-off point where you say, this is the incremental difference is maybe not worth the investment of getting the data and analyzing it all, right? Is there, like, how do you assess that?
I mean, it's always hard, but I guess just like thinking about the impact of a feature and the return of it versus the effort of building it, the data behind it and measuring it, everything, and just kind of doing that kind of impact effort analysis to see whether it's worth that big risk. And sometimes it'd be hard to say whether it really is worth it or not, but I guess just as you take more of these risks, you also learn whether it was worth it or not.
Right. So there's a bit of experience and kind of pattern recognition that comes with age, actually. Good question from Alibabas or Alibas about tools, which actually I was just thinking we should talk about. So they're asking, Ali Abbas, thank you. What's your favorite analytical tool and why?
Honestly, I haven't explored too many tools, and I've been meaning to try out Amplitude for a really long time, and I haven't had the opportunity. But my go-to tool has been Mixpanel. It's one of the first ones that I've used, and I just think it's so easy to use, and there's so much good functionality in there that really helps you dig into the data. And so I think just because I'm comfortable with it, it's something that I recommend a lot, especially for measuring more detailed product analytics versus things like Google Analytics, which I think is like, it's good for websites, but I personally find that interface pretty difficult to use. Whereas Mixpanel, I think it's like it's built for it.
I see. Okay, yeah, and that's really focusing in on user behavior, right? Talk to us a little bit about how you set that up. Like, are there some sort of basic things that you start to put in place and track, or what? How would you recommend a new product manager who's just starting with a tool like that? Where do they start, right?
Yeah, I guess it's going back to the idea of that North Star metric, and then thinking about that journey across that North Star metric and how they'll reach that end goal, and what are the most important events towards reaching that. And maybe those are the first few events and streams that you track. And then a lot of other stuff is kind of standard, like you can just see retention, you can see how many users are in your app and engaging with it. So I think like just focusing on the most important things to track through that North Star metric is a good way to get started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I guess you gradually become more granular as you understand their behavior and where the bottlenecks or stalls are, that sort of thing, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like where you need to dig in further and understand where they're dropping off. That's when maybe you'll start going into more detail with what events and screens you need to track.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you guys focus a lot on data and analytics for product. Do you get into the marketing automation side and, like thinking about the sales funnel or pipeline and the analytics around that? Or is that sort of outside of your domain?
It's a bit outside of my domain.
Okay. No worries. Another question here from Angel or Anghal. How do you feel about services such as Sensory Tower or Any app for data collection for product improvement?
Yeah, I made use of those a lot just to understand things like the ratings the ranking of the app and how it's doing in the App Store compared to competitors, and tracking that on a weekly or monthly basis to see whether we can make the App Store more optimal and optimize for that. So I definitely see the value in those tools as well. Cool.
Are there other areas of analytics that are interesting or emerging that you guys are talking about? And what comes to mind, of course, is AI. Is that something that you guys are thinking about?
That's not for any of the products that I've worked on recently.
Okay. And the other thing I was wondering is how do you approach the setup or the data collection for, let's say, a mobile app versus a website or something, or another type of app that you guys might be working on for a client?
Mm-hmm. So I think for mobile apps, it's a lot more event or user behavior driven to inform what you should track. Versus on the website, I guess pages are one of the most important things, and like seeing how long they spend on certain pages and then where they click off from one page to the other, and understanding that that customer journey on the website. So I think though, either way, it's just about understanding what are the end goals for that user, whether they're on an app or a website, and then breaking that down into things that you can measure.
Yeah, for sure. And a large part of what we've been talking about is user behavior in a product or app. What about the back-end functions like performance or scalability? Are those things, where do those fit into these kinds of measurements?
That's true. That's a good point. It's usually kind of like off to the side, but it's definitely still very important. I think for a lot of like the performance and things like that, it's not until that there's an issue that you really focus on it. So once, let's say, you start seeing a ton of crashes in the app, that's when looking at the crash rate becomes very important. But I think in general, if you have a product that really needs to be extremely reliable and there are issues there, it's important to also have dashboards and ways to make sure that your runtime or your uptime is like 100%, and tracking that and making sure that your servers are good and that kind of thing.
Right. More of a knock kind of approach, yeah. Well, let's talk about dashboards for a moment. What does that look like to you, and do you make use of them a lot? What would be the key things to to pay attention to or focus on in creating a dashboard?
So I think for a lot of dashboarding tools, there's a bit of like a setup process. And sometimes it's hard to display a certain thing in a dashboard, or sometimes you're focused on filling up that dashboard with all the different metrics and instead of just focusing on what really matters. But either way, I think it's one other thing is that like you want to make sure that what you're seeing on that dashboard is something you can take action on versus just looking at. Because I think sometimes you end up just like forgetting about that dashboard, like you built it once and then it's kind of, you look at it once a month and it's like, well, you're not really going to make use of that information anymore.
Right. It really has to be data and metrics that you want to track almost on a real-time basis, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, you need a snapshot at that particular moment. Or whenever you want to look at it, right? And especially to have alerts around things that are off trend or whatever. That's interesting. Well, we've got a couple of other good questions here. Chantel is saying that I'm a product designer trying to convince my product owner that implementing analytics is a valuable step that should be amongst our top priorities before we tackle new features. Do you have any pointers on how Chantel might pitch this to the product owner?
I think one way to really help sell the idea that you need some sort of analytics is by asking questions. And I mean, if you don't have the information, then you need to find a way to measure it. And so if you can show how the answers to these questions are going to impact how you design something, or how you can't make a decision on how we design this because we don't have this information, we don't really understand the user behavior here, then I think that's a pretty strong argument to say that we need this versus just guessing that this is going to work.
Right. It kind of goes back to our earlier discussion about opinion versus data, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Whose opinion is more real, I guess. Yeah. Cool. Rhythm also has a question, which is that at Crowdlinker, you're also providing services and growth marketing like SEO. How does that align with the product management team and the use of data and analytics?
Yeah, so we also have kind of like a digital marketing side where the focus is either on helping clients with running ads and helping them get more acquisition, or maybe on SEO and just boosting their online presence that way. And so there's definitely a lot of, with every website that we build, there's definitely a strong collaboration between, kind of like the user experience and SEO, and ensuring that we're both doing a good job with the converting users, but also acquiring users through organic search and that kind of thing. So there's definitely a lot of data that we pull from things like Google Search Console, GA itself, and a bunch of like SEO tools like SEMrush, Ahrefs, that kind of thing, to do an audit of the existing website from more of like a digital perspective.
Right. And that actually does get into a little bit the sort of marketing automation type funnel, is how do we improve our prospect pipeline and conversion rates and that sort of thing. Yeah, interesting. Great. Angel has another interesting question here. If you release a product feature that initially leads to a large level of user engagement, but then fizzles out after a time period, would you keep iterating on it to try to create constant user engagement, or pause it to cut losses? And how do you know when to make that call?
That's a really tough question. I guess it's, as you're iterating, you want to understand, why are the users fizzling out? Is it just because this is like a nice to have feature versus something that's really solving a problem? Or can you move it more towards turning it into something that does solve a user's problem, in which they'll see more value in it versus something that they check out once, but it's not something that they'll keep coming back to. So maybe that's part of it. And so I think having some of that qualitative data on that is when it's really helpful, just to be able to form hypotheses to say, this is why users aren't returning. And if you have the answers to that, I think that'll really help you make that decision in terms of whether it's worth investing more time. If there's like a really strong reason why users aren't doing this again, then maybe it's not worth the effort to keep iterating, because it's never going to be actually solving their problem or something like that.
Right. And that's where the qualitative comes in really important, because it's helping you understand why they're behaving that way, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess another approach is to step back a little bit in terms of the context or the user story and say, okay, what were they doing before and after that? And are there any patterns about those that, you know, we didn't retain or that used it more frequently, right? So you start to understand the context of their behavior as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Interesting. That's good. And is something like mixed panel helpful at sort of changing your detail level, if you will?
Yeah, I'd say so, because you can kind of compare between different events or different things that they're doing within the app and seeing maybe either the funnel of how they're doing it and like their whole journey, or just comparing usage of one feature over another to get a sense of that context.
Nice. That's great. Another question has come from Faze, who says, what is the most undervalued analytical competency which should be leveraged more by product managers?
I don't really know how to answer that, because I don't know what an analytical competency is. But I think one challenge that we have with data as product managers is we're not data scientists. So being able to like really interpret data and make sure that you're interpreting it properly, I think is definitely a challenge. And so I hope this kind of answers your question. But I think one really important thing to remember is that your beliefs can help you kind of skew the data to view it one way versus the other. And it can be pretty easy to like take a snapshot of the information and say, here, this is what it means, and like this is why we should do it this way, versus thinking through what other ways there might be to interpret it, what the context might be behind it, and why it might be showing up that way versus what it just looks like from face value.
Right. So bias can be a part of this for sure. And figuring out ways to question what assumptions you might be making is important. Are there things that you personally do to kind of keep control of that or guard against it? You know, like what, you know, how do you identify, oh, I'm making an assumption or I'm biased here, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's always hard, right? To try to uncover your own biases. One way I like to do that is just kind of thinking through the different pitfalls there might be in trusting this data, or taking that data and then looking at it from an outside perspective, as if you weren't the one that collected that data and analyzed it, but as if someone else gave you that information and now you're questioning whether that really makes sense or not, and just kind of taking it outside or like step back from the data for a second.
And I assume that working with multi-dimensional teams helps that too, because other people have different perspectives on that data. So instead of you just analyzing it yourself, kind of having a group think a little bit about it, or, you know, ask questions helps. Yeah,
for sure. So sharing it out and having other people also interpret it, I think it's super helpful. And also just when they do ask questions, that's like, oh, that's actually really interesting. Maybe I did look at that the wrong way. So I think having more people view the data versus just you as a product manager sharing that data out is pretty helpful.
Cool. And do you have, tell us a little bit about how your teams work at Crowdlinker. You have a couple of product managers. Do they work closely with designers or UX folks or technical lead? Like, just describe for us briefly how that kind of interaction works.
Yeah, so for every client engagement, there's basically like a separate team working on that. So you have a product manager on that team, you have a designer and an engineer, maybe multiple engineers on that team. And so ideally what we really want to do is have that whole team focused on that product and just that project at a time, versus kind of being split between different things or being in more of like a waterfall approach where it's just the product manager and the designer in the beginning and then you bring in the engineer. But ideally you kind of work in this agile process where that whole team is just focused on that and they're iterating and all working together at the same time.
Cool. We have a few more minutes, so if there's other questions from the participants, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them and keep chewing on this a little bit. But I wanted to ask you, Alison, about something a little off topic, and that's that you're involved with the Women in Product Management initiative or community. Tell us a little bit about that and why that's important.
Yeah, so this initiative, which is that I run the Women in Product Toronto community with one other chapter lead, it started about 2 years ago. We're coming up on our 2-year anniversary soon. And so Women in Product is a nonprofit and it started in the Bay Area, and then they have a bunch of chapters worldwide. So we started the local chapter, and the reason that we really wanted to do this was just because there wasn't a space specifically for women in product management. And I think one one thing that was really important to us was just having that safe space where you can connect with other women. Sometimes you're maybe the only woman in your team or your company. And so we wanted to make sure that there was like some other avenue for other female product managers to talk to others.
Great. And mentoring is, of course, pretty important too, right? You know, to have some leaders that really understand, have been sort of down that track and can help guide too. Well, good for you. I think that's a great initiative. You know, we started the TPMA 20 years ago now, under the same, you know, premise, really, not based on gender or anything, but really just because there were so few product managers around, and nobody goes to university for product management, so we needed to find a way to network and share and learn together, right? So I think that's fantastic. What do you think in your background led you to be particularly sensitive to data and analytics?
I guess it's just coming from that kind of analytical background where, like in engineering, when you're solving a problem, it's like either right or wrong. It's like a yes or no, black and white answer. And so you kind of want that same kind of sense of comfort in knowing that what you're building is like right or wrong, or successful or not successful. And so I think having data helps kind of reduce the amount of ambiguity there is.
Yeah, that's cool. That's great. So there's another question here, which we can have a few more questions, but there's a question about where people can find further information. And maybe the way I'll frame it is, what kind of things do you follow to keep current on data and analytics in the product space? Or is there an analytics blog or any particular people and influencers you follow? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sometimes it's just through articles. So I subscribe to a lot of different email newsletters. And so sometimes there'll be an article about data analytics that catches my eye. I think another good way to become maybe a little bit more, or to hear other perspectives about data and analytics, is just through podcasts and finding specific ones, specifically from like a product management podcast, and then they're talking about data analytics. I think those are two great sources. Okay,
cool. And if you were mentoring or recommending for a new product manager who might not necessarily have an analytic background or skill set, is there anything specific that you would recommend they start with in terms of a framework for thinking about this or learning about it?
Maybe some online courses related specifically to data and analytics. And then I think from there, it's just really about trying it out. I think it's like a lot easier said than done. Like retention, this is like one definition and that's all you need to know about. But once you start trying to measure it and understand it and interpret your information, it becomes a lot more nuanced and tricky. And so I think just like going through that experience is really going to help you build your experience.
Yeah. And so the follow on to that is, for a new product manager or somebody that's just getting kind of immersed in data and analytics, what are your tips that they should pay attention to at the beginning? When you talked a little bit before about the challenges and that sort of thing, but what in order for them to get off on the right track, how would they start?
I think just always having the goals in mind. So either it's the goals about the overall product or what you're building out right now, but just having that goal in mind so that you don't get lost in the data and your data is focused towards measuring or increasing that goal. I think that's pretty important.
Okay, great. Yeah, there's a comment from Rhythm who's just saying if you're completely new to digital analytics, there's a free Google Analytics course, and they give you access to the Google Merchandise Store account so you can get hands-on practice, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, that's cool.
Nice.
I think we're just about out of time, but maybe one last question, and that's where do you see data and analytics going over the next few years? If you had a crystal ball and you could sort of project, okay, what's going to be major trends or influences? What would you say?
So I think a major trend, and I think it's already happening right now with Mixpanel, so trying to use that data and give you insights versus you having to go through and trying to find your own insights. So they have tools, I think it's called like Signal or something, where they're trying to predict how that data is going, like the success of certain features or events or things in your app based on the data. And I think that's like an overall a challenge that product managers face is like, how do you interpret your data? So the more and more that tools can themselves help you interpret that data, I think is going to be an interesting trend.
Nice, nice. And presumably we'll see lots more tools just because we've got such a proliferation of massive amounts of data. We're going to need tools to help us get the insights, right? Yeah.
And what would be great is if there's just one tool that I can just like plug all my information into, and then you tell me what's going on here. You analyze all this for me.
That's called a product manager. Yes. Yes. Once you sort of, clone a product manager, then you could do that. Yeah. Alison, this has been wonderful talking to you. It's been a good chance to get to know you a little better, and I look forward to seeing you in person when we can all get together again. And best of luck with all the things you're doing at Crowdlinker. Keep in touch with the community, and thanks so much for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, Alison. Really appreciate it. Everybody stay safe, keep healthy, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Lee. Bye.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.